Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be, whatever time zone. I know the group that we have here assembled is representing potentially multiple time zones. I thought Reg might be in California, but as we go through the introductions, you'll find out where we are. So we appreciate you all dropping in on our chat to continue to talk about how to drive from X to 10X and really get the CEO or the upper management perspective on how this works across the spectrum. So from launch to pre-launch, all the way to products that have been in market for some time, both on the pharma side and then the device and diagnostic side. So without any further intro from me, other than I'm Jamie Peck, I lead our commercial organization for Indegene here in the US. Let me introduce our distinguished panel here. So first, Sharon Cunningham. Sharon is the co-founder of Shorla Pharma in Ireland. They're developing new cancer treatments. Prior to Shorla, she held various positions at Ergen Pharma, and prior to that, she was a chartered accountant at PwC, holds an MBA from the College of Dublin, and a BS in finance from the University of Cork, or College Cork, Ireland. So welcome, Sharon. Abhay, many people probably know Abhay Gandhi. Abhay is the CEO of North America Sun Pharma. Prior to Sun, several positions at Boehringer, also Nestle India, member of the Executive Management Committee of the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association, and a member of the Confederation of Indian Industry National Committee on Drugs and Pharmaceutical. So he's also the vice chairman of Targo Pharmaceuticals and has a postgraduate degree in marketing from CVKM Narseh Monge Institute of Management Studies. So, and Abhay is probably 1 mile from where I am right now. Either if he's home or in his office, he's still 1 mile from me. Yeah. So thank you, Abhay. Subhasis Banerjee. Subhasis is actually an inventor and an entrepreneur. He's really pioneering the area around digital health. So his company, Symphony, has developed a new generation of wireless stroke rehabilitation products for the functional recovery of paralyzed limbs. So not a drug solution, but a digital health solution. Past experience includes sales and marketing stops along the way at a number of different companies. And he holds a PhD in actually, Subhasis, this is way too smart for me. Biomechatronics in applied physics and physio-neurorehabilitation from Nanyang Technological University, and is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore. So Sharon's in Ireland, Abhay's in New Jersey, and Subhasis is in Singapore. And then Reg, who I thought was going to be in California, is in Maryland. So Reg Cito is the president and chief business officer of CareDx. Prior to CareDx, he had held very senior positions at companies like Ardelex, AstraZeneca, Organon, Boehringer Ingelheim, and then started out his career at McKinsey. He's also a physician, a trained physician, an MD. So that's our group, and we will get started. The format is we'll have very interactive discussion. We're going to try to keep this as free form as possible, although I don't want to be known as the next Chris Wallace. I want to make sure I do a better job than he did on Tuesday night. And then just let us talk, and then by about 45 minutes or so in, we'll sum up and take questions from the audience. So with that, I'll just get started. So we've heard a lot over the last several days, or at least the course of the summit, which is a little bit of a different construct this year for obvious reasons, about how to drive from X to 10X. That's a super meaty objective. It's not something that it's something that can be on paper, but it isn't something that is always enacted upon in the most active way. So it's been tremendously valuable to hear from a lot of these leaders. But then how do we implement that? So what I'd like to do is start with you, Sharon, and say, you're in the launch and development mode right now. It's a little bit of a different environment than even all of the other panelists are. There are unique to the times challenges that are happening, obviously, with COVID. How have you kind of reconnoitered your launch approach, both in the U.S. and globally, to address that? And then, more importantly, which of those changes that you are implementing do you think will stick post the environment that we're in?
Thanks, Jamie, and greetings everybody from Ireland. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Indegene for inviting me. Jamie, yes, as you know, we speak quite a lot in recent times, and we're very much in our pre-launch stage. We're actively engaging remotely with potential commercial partners, and we're facing really very, very important decisions from a commercialization perspective that will ultimately inform the strategic direction of the company. And it's really unfortunate that we can't actually meet those key stakeholders face to face at this time. However, we are making the very best of the situation. And I really feel as a company that we're working a lot smarter. We're continuously asking ourselves the question, what's truly worth pursuing? We've grown to accept video conferencing as a really effective networking tool. We would have traveled a huge amount across the world before COVID hit. So we're actually saving a lot of money, and we're saving a lot of time and making very effective use of our time. That said, clearly there's no substitute for face-to-face meetings, and I realize now more than ever how crucial they are to driving things forward. But I think for us and for other companies in the space, it will be about finding a balance in our new normal. I think we will have learned a huge amount from this crisis, and I think it will bring about a lot of positive change in terms of the effective use of technology, etc. And I really hope that we emerge out of it as a better global society with systemic vulnerabilities exposed and our priorities reset accordingly. So, Jamie, in summary, we're making the absolute best we can of the situation, using a lot more technology, engaging with key stakeholders differently, but very grateful to be making progress nonetheless. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the perspectives of the other panelists as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. I mean, Abhay, we'll just to build on that, I'd ask you, because your business, at least the part that we're most familiar with, was very well focused on the long-term care setting. And that long-term care setting was obviously you've lost or had lost most access to that. So what sort of technological approaches did you put into place to address and help?
So in any established company, unlike Sharon, who has the luxury of creating the organization that she wishes to, in a large organization, you have businesses in different phases of their life cycle. So you have some which are like mature businesses, some which are like growth businesses, some may be in a sustenance mode, and some may be even in a decay mode. So there is no one strategy which fits all in our kind of an environment in the organization that I represent. Having said that, I mean, when you mention about the LTC, for example, this is a newer segment for us. So we consider ourselves as a startup. Just maybe we are lucky enough to be a well-funded startup. And you're right, in the LTC, I think it was one of the first segments where we lost access to customers. And I think we may be the last to gain access to customers in that segment. We were a little fortunate that even before we were engulfed by this environment, we had started going the non-personal promotion way. And that's where I think we started talking to you and Indegene and the others in the group to look at how can we, expand our products beyond LTC. So our focus wasn't just LTC. It was actually going beyond LTC. And some of that early learning, fortuitously for us, turned out to be a great learning when we were forced to adopt technologies that the organization and individuals within the team were not familiar with. So I guess we got lucky. I claim it as foresight, but the fact is we just got lucky.
Yeah. I think that there's some truth to that. And I've said that as well, that there's, the things that we were thinking about were just accelerated. And
right. Absolutely. I mean, we started working on this close to a year ago.
Yeah.
And you guys were there with us all the way through. And it just so happened that about the time we were able to really start up and go live, we were forced to go live. So
yep. So that's an interesting, that kind of leads to a good segue, Abhay. I'll direct the next question to you as well, is there is this tremendous pressure to scale up quickly, but in a way that is sometimes outside of the traditionally thoughtful and planful DNA of pharma, right? Companies like Google and Amazon like to move very quickly, and that whole notion of failing fast, but that's outside of pharma's true DNA. Pharma takes time. But there's tremendous pressure to scale up quickly. So how do we reconcile that, or how have you reconciled that? And how have you chosen to use partners to do that, to outsource or keep things inside at Sun?
So I think one of the reasons why pharma is forced to be a little slower, or let's call it more measured and cautious as compared to some of the other industries like the Googles and the Amazons you mentioned, is that we are a highly regulated industry. Whether it is about bringing a drug to market from the R&D labs, or the production of that drug, which Alok is facing right now, or let's say, how do you market it, you have to keep the regulatory environment in mind. Some of these companies are luckier than we are. So a Google or an Amazon can launch a product in market with live customers and consumers with, let's call it, a prototype version or a beta version. The pharma industry does not have that luxury. I mean, we can't develop the next vaccine and launch it as a beta version or a prototype version. I mean, that's not correct, and that's just not going to happen. So therefore, I think as an industry, we have to be more thoughtful of what we do, and look at the entire legal, regulatory environment before we take any step. Others, including other things like, does the solution have SG&A compliance, HIPAA compliance, data security? A lot of issues need to be thought through before you jump into it. So I'm not really a big fan of jumping from a X to a 10X for the sake of it. And I would rather have a more thoughtful approach, because we also belong to a school of thought that the worst time to make a decision is when emotions are at their peak. And when emotions are at their peak, you tend to make wrong decisions, and you have a follow the herd mentality. But I think to watch out for signals of how much is the stickiness of the new environment and the new learnings, how much of that will stick on when the situation normalizes. What is the learning that we can take from these, not just from our own industry, but also from other industries, and see how they have been able to cope up, what have been their successes, what have been their learnings, failures. I think would help each company to draw its own path. So while the goal of being X to 10X, I think has a meaning that you need to move and move fast. But I think to also look at that as not to make big mistakes, which could hurt organizations in the long term, I think is equally important. And as I said, companies, in different life cycles have different risk appetites. It's easier to make a mistake in maybe a smaller organization, and Sharon would argue it's the other way around. It's, you probably can hide your mistakes better in larger organizations. So I get that point of view as well. But you need to look at any organization not as one single whole, but different businesses within them, and what is it that you need to do for each business.
Sure. Thank you. That makes sense. And Subhasis, I think that's a good, you're in a little bit of a different space in the wearable business, which is getting a lot of attention these days. It's almost like 10X is the expectation when people start to, and I don't think people really understand what digital health or wearable, or however you want to phrase it, and even Reg, right? Like some of the data that you're collecting, I think people just expect that 10X is the starting point. And also, both of you have patient populations that are at significant risk with comorbidity, you with stroke and Reg with transplant. But there's a lot of moving parts as you, Subhasis, launch your product. It's what I would kind of call a game of whack-a-mole, if you know the at least that's a U.S. term, where like you kind of whack down one thing and something else pops up, another problem. So as you prepare for your launch, Subhasis, how are you implementing things or integrating things like data strategy and analytics strategy and those tools with the therapy so that we know exactly, or you know exactly how that's informing?
Yeah. So, we were in a very unique situation because 2020 was our scaling year and fundraising year. And so COVID actually threw a challenge at our business as a whole, which means simultaneously reach more patients while reducing burn rate. Because as you know, several things changed on the ground when it came to funding, when it came to people talking, as well as the fact that patients needed to change behavior in order to adapt to the new system. So in some ways, it hit us in the face. I can still not, and I probably won't forget for a long time, the simultaneous lockdowns that happened across Asia and Southeast Asia in mid-March. But I think in hindsight, it has helped in the last 6 months enormously de-risk our business. So that's the upside. And although we are in the wearable space in a visible sense, the real solution, I think, lies in the data, which, and especially the real-time data that the patient sees to sense, his or her instantaneous reactions, which are either supporting or hampering the recovery of cognition and mobility. So one great benefit we seem to have mined over the past 6 years, being a therapeutics company, is the extent to which a chronic patient can drive his or her own recovery, outside supervised therapy sessions. And that actually really helped during COVID because we did 30% of supervised sessions and 70% unsupervised sessions using the wearables. Another insight which COVID brought to the table was the fact that patients adapt and they adopt, given no other choice. And so that was another unique, situation to leverage for us. And once they do that, then we can continue to demonstrate outcomes in spite of nearly zero physical touch points between therapist and patients. So, along with reaching patients X to 10X, which I think is somewhat easier, we actually we regrounded ourselves, as Abhay said, because we wanted by design to make sure as far as possible that the outcomes kept pace. Else, the scale would be really, really short-lived. So as we prepare for scale, we first focused on what we needed to change in our practice and protocols so that outcomes do not suffer in general and they do not vary too much across outlets and geographies, because that's typically what happens when on one hand, therapists are trying to cope and patients are trying to cope. And our first data objective right now, as you rightly asked, Jamie, is to implement an optimization plan around outcomes and outcomes variance. Thus, I think it also creates a unique new competitive edge for us, sitting on top of our already patented system. So this we are doing internally and we are black boxing it. And for everything else, we are looking to outsource the processes and development to digital partners. The other thing we faced as a startup, and especially as a startup in 3 geographies already, is that digital transformation, essentially, we realized is a culture transformation. So we've done a few, weird things, if you may. So for example, during this lockdown, we introduced clinical staff to Python and data visualization tools. And this is not, in order to get them to do coding, but so that they start speaking the same language to our data scientists. And also, in some ways, fine-tune the data-driven outcomes from the front lines. On my side, with my daughter as consultant, I've been studying dating sites. And let me tell you where that comes from. Because we are finding more and more that when we try to match patient to HCP, we also need to now do a persona matching and not just, matching of a medical condition with a medical qualification. And that's becoming very, very important in long-term care, and especially as we try to scale through partners. So I think unless some fundamental shifts are implemented within the new digital processes, the X to 10X scaling effort will only probably progress in fits and starts. And a big mistake to avoid is to imagine a digital system which replicates, your existing analog system. Right. Lastly, I think we should not lose sight of the fact that what really killed the hundreds and thousands in the past few months was not just the virus, but underlying chronic conditions. So while we've grown about the tens of millions infected, we should not blindside ourselves to the billion plus, living with chronic conditions. And another pandemic or a natural disaster will again disproportionately impact the same population. So for us as a company, the overall guiding light, if you will, is to keep our eyes firmly on these patient groups who need us the most, while we try and tackle, the multiple moving parts.
Yep. The first thing I'd ask is, does your wife know that you're visiting the dating sites? But we'll leave that. I mean, you can always make you can make it a work project.
Yes.
No, it is amazing because the top 3 dating sites have a methodology, and that's swipe left, swipe right. And when you look at that as behavior of how people choose, and how, once you like somebody else likes back before a conversation starts, that's really in one way very different with how we've matched, medical professionals to patients previously, as well as the fact that in long-term care, a persona match plays a big role. And it's not just about a prescription, but it's about, meeting and building an association. If you look at mental health, for example, the association that's built between the two, the provider or the counselor and the patient, is significantly of a different quality than just somebody looking for a prescription. Yeah, so dating sites were great eye-opener. And it's been a long, long time since I've done that. So it was quite a learning process, thanks to my daughter.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously all of you have patient populations that are more at risk, and that notion that it's not just and this isn't a COVID discussion per se, or it's not supposed to be, but I think you'd be a little bit remiss not to recognize the current environment. But there are now underlying conditions that are creating a larger problem. People are dying not only from COVID directly, but other things. So Sebastis, I think that's exactly right. Sharon, as you launch, or as you build your pipeline and then bring your products to market, how are you thinking about patients specifically? I know that the conversations we've had have been very focused on that face-to-face at times, and then digital at times, patient interaction. But is the physician or is the patient themselves part of the process in your mind?
It's not directly for our particular products. Obviously, the patient will be very much considered as part in the process, but no, the pharmacists and the payers really are what's the focus for us.
Yeah, okay.
And I think it'll be like a hybrid approach. So in person and digital will be, the direction that we'll be going in.
Yeah.
And so I think we'll actually really benefit from this, because a lot of change is happening, and a lot of new norms are being adopted, and so we can adopt them from the start as opposed to trying to innovate in that space ourselves.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I think that's kind of what Abhay was referring to when he's at a multinational company that's well established, right, Abhay? And then you've got it's harder. It's like there are some processes and sometimes even bureaucracies in place that are less agile, and so that makes that more difficult. And then I do think this notion that Sebastis introduced around owning the patient is something that Reg has a perspective on, I know. And Reg's perspective, and to me, is very interesting. So I'd love to hear more. We'd love to hear more, as both being a consultant at McKinsey, a physician in the pharma space at big pharma and small pharma, and now in the device and diagnostic. That patient journey is critical, and the data that's collected, and you and I have talked about this. How do you see those strategies intersecting around personalizing the patient journey and then kind of quote unquote owning that patient throughout that journey?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Firstly, to you and Indegene for the opportunity to be here today. Also, it's been fascinating to listen to each of the panelists as they share their views, and just given we all have various stages of where we are as companies and different sectors, it's really great to hear how you've all been responding to incorporate digital as part of your day-in-day operations. I think one thing is most folks may not know CareDx. We're a company that's been around for more than 20 years, 100% focused on transplant. And it's only really the last 2-3 years we've come really on the radar screen. And I think I'll share a bit more of why that's the case. But essentially, our mission is very much focused on bringing innovation to helping transplant patients' organ viability. And that's through surveillance and we've really brought just the latest technology. And I think we're the first to bring, for example, gene expression profiling in heart transplant. We're the first to bring donor-derived cell-free DNA in transplant, including in kidney. And so we're also the first to bring a validated transplant AI algorithm as well, which was published in BMJ last year. So really important for us is to drive innovation as a company. And so our vision is actually focused on the patient journey. And last year, when we were developing our board presentation, for example, we said deliberately, how do we become more involved in that patient journey? Because historically, we've been very much post-surveillance, like after the actual transplant per se. So we actually made a very deliberate focus into how do we incorporate digital into that patient journey. More importantly, how do we use and leverage it in this day and age? Because digital technologies, et cetera, are so critical. It means many things to many people. And so for us, we then said, knowing that patient journey from, and I'll just take kidney as an example, right? The pre-transplant, those who may have CKD, then eventually move on to dialysis, then moving on to peri-transplant during the operation, then moving on to transplant, and then 1 in 5 patients actually go back into transplant in the kidney space, so their organs fail within 5 years. So it's this continuous spectrum and journey is absolutely critical that we understand, not just the thoughts of the decision making, the clinical decision making, what are the parameters to intervene each of these points, but what are the specific behaviors of the patients that are absolutely critical in this continuum. So one of the things that we did is actually we had a deliberate strategy to actually invest in digital. So we made 2 acquisitions last year, specifically one to get more on the pre-transplant pace. We bought a company called Zen Management, which actually had a group that actively managed patients pre-transplant. And then they also had an interaction with each of the centers from a quality perspective. We also bought a company called Otter, where they actually were the EMR interface for more than 60 transplant centers in the United States. And there are only about 230 transplant centers in the United States. So this is a very, very deliberate strategy. How do we get more involved in this digital continuum? Because it's absolutely critical as we're along that space. So what I can say, though, is as a result of 2020, as terrible as COVID has been, those investments, those bets in digital, that very, very deliberate strategy has really helped accelerate our business. And that's because of our absolute focus on that patient journey. And our business actually, interestingly enough, is exceeding what was, projected at the start of the year pre-COVID. And I think that's been recognized by all the analysts in our last earnings result as well. And I think, it wasn't always the case when it hit in March. And I just, diverge for a moment. Living donor transplants went down by 90%. Deceased donor transplants went down by 50%. So, how is a company like this going to respond and react? And I think these investments in that deliberate digital strategy, whether you call it the X to 10X, but it was making it part and every day of that patient journey. And so if we look at, that actual very deliberate strategy, I think we obviously have reacted during this time. And I'll share some of the proactive things that has enabled us to do. We were able to put together the largest transplant data registry in the world. And that was only because we had an existing platform through Otter. And that allowed us to build this very rapid registry as part of that. The other thing we were able to do was within 4 days of the country essentially shutting down its borders in March, we were able to roll out a very patient-specific program called RemoTrack. And that's because we understood our patients. Our patients had concerns about going into the transplant centers to get their monitoring and blood tests. We knew they also had concerns going into the specimen collection centers. And so we built a whole new program for them within a period of 4 days. And that was the system called RemoTrack, where they were able to get mobile phlebotomy. And I think, we wouldn't have had that ability if we hadn't made these earlier investments into digital. And digital is a broad spectrum, right? I think as Sebastis has talked, we also have moved into digital in the sense of, data is absolutely critical. That interaction with the patient is absolutely critical. Last week, on Saturday, we just launched our patient app. It's called AlloCare. And that was done with, over 1,000 patients coming in on a weekend, learning about what we do. Many of them very familiar with us at CareDx. But this absolute closeness, this absolute ability to know the patient is so important for us as a company. And we know that we play a space in the pre-transplant, and now we've moved in post-transplant, and even further now, as we look in the community, we've broadened further. So we've hired 50 plus more what we call field patient care managers, and these are the folks that interact with patients directly. And now we're also building this connection more on a digital basis. So as I think of the audience, digital means many things, but in the sense of how it can enable your business is absolutely critical. Now, in Sebastian's case, it may be that digital is actually more the actual business itself. But by doing this, it provides us the flexibility, optionality eventually to do a lot more if we do want to build a larger digital business as well. And I think many companies today have responded that way and built a core business. But for us, that initial bet, that initial strategy was so important as we are, and it's really helped us in 2020.
Yeah, that's really a great perspective, Reg. Thank you. I think maybe direct this to Abhay and then to Sharon. So that's an interesting point that Reg makes, that in Sebastian and Reg's business, digital is really the offering to a certain extent, where for Abhay, would you look at it as more of an enabler? So it's either tech as the infrastructure, or tech or digital as an enabler to get to that end. And maybe you can talk for a second about that.
I mean, like the other panelists have said, I mean, I view digital not as an end in itself. It is more a medium, or let's call it what we call in the pharmaceutical world a delivery system. So the delivery system in the pharmaceutical world gets the drug to the patient. And in this case, we're talking about getting your messages and your connect out to the customers or the consumers. So it's, I think, more of a medium. And whichever method gets you that connect quickly, seamlessly, and enables you to form a differential is something I would adopt, digital being one of them. Having said that, there are certain parts of the business which are like digital ready, for example, and I'm not even looking at IT, for example, finance. A lot of finance and functions within finance, not just within our company, but globally, have been digitized and have been mobile across geographies. And you can have a centralized financial organization doing a lot of work without having to make it geography specific. So digital has already enabled that. There are some which are a little less enabled, but it's getting there. Let's take an example of the education sector. I think through watching and learning what educational institutes do in terms of trying to use digital media to teach and train and develop students for tomorrow, I think that learning can be adapted by the pharmaceutical industry and then looked at, can we globally, have digital training platforms which can then remove the need for having those face-to-face interaction. Now, the learning for this will come from the education sector and not necessarily within the pharmaceutical sector. So as I said at the beginning, I think this is also a time to watch and learn, not just what's happening within your own sphere, but also look at other industries, their responses, and where can you learn from and adapt it to your own organizations.
I think Jamie has dropped off.
Yeah, I think he probably lost.
While Jamie comes on, I might just add a comment before he joins us. I mean, I think Abhay, to me, the question is, how do people think of digital? And I think if I was in the RX world, I would have that similar perception. I think because I spent majority of my life there, but I think if I evolved more, particularly over the last 2 years, and I think with what Sebastian has done is, I think and he gave the example of the swipe left and right, but I do think behaviors and knowing the patient and the value of AI, I think, we will look at a very different world in 5 and 10 years time. And we already see that in the consumer segment with the ability to not necessarily influence, but the ability to understand these behaviors is so critical. And there's so much data that can be captured as we have these systems in place. And data is so powerful, particularly if it's on a longitudinal basis. But if it directs, and I think listening to basis that chronic management, it's creating whole ways of decision making now, whether it's influencing the patient, but also guiding physicians as part of that. So I would concur with your comments. So the only thing I'd say is, as we look at the macro landscape, how it involves, I think what we see today will be very different in 5 years' time. But also digital means many different things to different people. So I think data is probably one area that I probably didn't emphasize enough, because it's core to what we're doing, but it's something that I think Tobias is what he's doing as well.
Reg, to pick up on what you just said and what Abhay was referring to, I think one of the big changes that has occurred in this decade is that the burden of non-communicable disease has overtaken communicable disease, right? And hence the characteristics around healthcare delivery, etc., has also shifted, in my opinion. At least I see it very starkly in this part of the world. And when we say that, we see that consumer behavior will impact healthcare and design of healthcare solutions more than I think ever before. Whereas previously, both devices as well as other kinds of technologies were very much around medical protocol. But I think more and more consumer behavior is impacting design at a very basic level. So I see a fresh way of thinking about delivering care more from a standpoint of health, perhaps, rather than disease emerging. Because in our last 6 years, we've seen that when you go into people's homes and see exactly what the discussions are in there, it's more about health and less about disease. Whereas in a typical healthcare institutions, it's a little more different. Another thing that I notice already happening is that the data simplification and the minimalization is also starting to happen, as opposed to data density, because I'm finding that people are rapidly experiencing data fatigue, and they are beginning to throw away what, in their experience is non-essential. To stay, therefore, connected to the patient, at the level also that you mentioned, because each stage in that journey is so critical, I think is going to become more and more important. And I won't be surprised if it will, become just as important for pharma companies.
Yeah. I apologize, guys, but I was actually kicked off.
No. While you were not on the screen, we co-opted Reg as the new moderator.
Yes.
So
well, I hope Abhay, I hope you've booked your calendar till at least noon. If Reg is going to be the moderator, because that could take a while. So I don't know where you guys all left off. So I don't know. Was there something that
we continued the discussion and actually started talking amongst ourselves to, carry on with the topic. Another question which I would like to ask Jamie, with your permission, to my other three panelists, because they're in a different world in terms of where they are in the growth of their organization. How do you look at scalability of the entire digital world? Because take a simple example from the established pharmaceutical side. Now, if today a company like me, or even big companies, even bigger than Sun Pharma today, if we have to look at, can we ensure that all our medical reps, for example, have digital interaction with the doctors, okay, at least for part of their time, if not all of the time, then we have to think of globally, across different languages and cultures and all that, train close to 30,000 people in a short term to move from that X to 10X. And then you have the technological challenges, the language barriers, the cultural adoption of digital technologies. So how do you, in your different worlds, look at the whole issue of scalability?
Yeah, I think, Sharon, maybe you want to handle that one first, if you don't mind, because I think globally you're probably closest to that situation, at least from what I know about you.
Well, yeah, just to say, Jamie, so just to give people an understanding, so our focus is to improve established oncology drugs, to improve adherence, reduce patient discomfort, simplify caregiver assistance, and to reduce the cost of chemotherapy administration at home and in other treatment settings. And just in terms of digital and the question of whether that's, an offering or an enabler, I think I like the way Abhay put it as regards being a delivery system or a medium of enabling what we want to do. And how do we get our messages across? So while the oncologist and the prescribing pharmacist and ultimately the payer is our customer, the patient is obviously the end user of our products. And so our messaging is going to be extremely important, and how we scale that even more so. We're a virtual company. We have been from the very beginning. We have used technology and cloud-based systems for all aspects of running our company. We don't use paper. We don't have any paper in our company. We have employees that are working in different countries, and we are all connected. So for us, we actually don't know any different. We have grown up with digital technologies, and we almost, accept and assume that that's the way it'll be. So, this is very relevant. This whole topic is extremely relevant for us. And how do we go about meeting our objectives via virtual technologies? I'd love to hear other panelists' thoughts, people that are maybe further along than ourselves, because we're really at that phase at the moment of strategically considering, what's the best approach for us to enable us to achieve our vision.
Sure. Reg, do you want to address some of that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a few thoughts before I answer the question. I think in terms of scalability, which really came up, I think there's differences based on geography, US, ex-US. I think some of the regulatory constraints are different in different countries as well. And I think, even as you look at some of this questions of this evolution, I think the most important thing to understand is how is the digital space evolving? And to get to that point, I think as we discuss some of the things like the technology for interaction, to me, that's the minimum, right? That I mean, whether it's inside sales or whether it's, interaction with physicians. I mean, in Asia, they've been doing this in a very sophisticated way for a long time in certain markets. So I think there's a lot to learn, and we have a global audience here, right? So I think there's a lot to learn in terms of how we think about digital, but at a minimum, we should just expect that this interaction, which has been further accelerated by Zoom, I think, close to, we spoke to more than 150 centers in the United States. Again, there's only 230 plus in the first 8 weeks. And from them, 95% of those we're all doing telehealth, right? So I think as we think it's all been accelerated. So I think minimum, and some of them have now gone back, right? And some of it's due to financial incentives, like, there may be some differences now in reimbursement coming out with telehealth, et cetera. But the point being here is that it's a minimum, right? If you think of this scalability with technology, it has to be core and front and center. The way I look at for each of the audience members, I'm thinking of this for your business. How will this change in the next 2 years, and then more importantly, 5 years? So we always like to understand what is going to be the evolution. Because I think if you go back 5 years, I think the world I see and the technology I see and the innovation I see is very different. And you have macro events accelerating that. So in my space or my world, the macro event changing that is the executive order, for example, where now in transplant world, where it's expected the number of organs will double, right, by 2030, and it's expected that 80% of the patients will either be transplanted from ESRD or in home dialysis. So with that macro shift, we now have to adjust to that, which is how do you get more people into home monitoring in terms of that home dialysis, or how do you address the fact that the organ viability has to increase, and what is digital playing that role? So I think that it's a spectrum. Technology, the way we talk about it, is a minimum access and contact and continuity, these types of calls. But I think as you move forward, there's a continuum of how do we continue to push that? And I think the extreme was Sebastian's in some ways, which is, how do you understand the behaviors of, the patients or consumers and translate that further? That's really, really important. I think for us, getting that database is absolutely critical. But so I think, Jamie, this evolution of digital, but understanding what everyone means by it is so important. But it's going to just, accelerate the whole process, the way that we're going, the role it plays. And I would look at large pharma companies. I mean, several actually were ahead of the curve. Back even 10 years ago, there was one large pharma who was proactively investing in digital already, and everyone was always asking, why. So I think as you think of that, I think that it always takes innovation, even at these larger RX companies, to drive that.
I think one of the things we need to observe, because everybody today has a digital habit, okay, in their personal lives or otherwise, if not in their work lives, but everybody has typical digital habits. And when we try to change, a large workforce, instead of, putting in something as on top of what they already do, I mean, this is not in the context of the workforce, but I'll tell you what we did with patients. Instead of going to them with a system, we just spent the first 1 month of March observing what systems they already are on. Okay, so some of them were just on text, some were on WhatsApp, somewhere this, somewhere that. Some of them could actually do a desktop kind of a login into a Zoom call and stuff like that. So I think, when we make transformations of habits, it was the same with our therapists. So as you know, therapists are very non-digital, right? They are all hands-on. And one of the things we quickly rounded up among our therapists was that what are your existing digital habits? And do they match those of our patients? So, I would say as a starting point in a crisis situation, leveraging what people already are used to doing, we realized that even 80-year-olds, because a large part, 50% of our patients are above the age of 65, right? Even at that age, they do have digital habits, and if we can quickly bring that together and build something around that, then whether it's workforce, whether it's patients, it's just an idea, of course, very early days as yet, but to just see if that can be collected, studied, and leveraged, to shift how people work within an organization.
Perfect segue, Subhasis, because we have some questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna take those now for the next 10 minutes or so, or however long it takes. So you did, and right into what you were just saying, Subhasis. So this is for you. You mentioned that digital transformation is a cultural change. Can you just build on that a little bit or elaborate just a bit?
I will just give you when the interface of clinicians and engineers occur, right? And that's the technology domain. And a company like ours, which is technology led but delivers service. Languages are very different. The language in medical school is very different from the language in engineering school. And in a digital transformation, what we found is it adds to that complexity, because the language of data is again very different. And so one of the things we did was we did some initial familiarization of our therapists with tools like Python, with tools like data visualization tools, etc., just so that the conversation and the language and the words change. So, and that's, I think in some ways it seeds the culture. So it's not always clinicians are talking, clinical language, but now they are talking data language. And at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, right? So I think one of these conversation gaps is a good starting point. And, I won't say that some great transformation has happened, but now when somebody suddenly says that I'm trying to do this with the data, etc., you don't have to spend too much time with the clinicians trying to figure out whether that's the right way to go or not, because ultimately we want the clinicians to drive the data, right? So that's just the first step, if you will, or just one idea.
Yeah, no, perfect. And I think that actually this is a really good question that I'd like to share, and then maybe hear just a minute or so from everybody, or just a quick thought. It's about talent, and you all have different perspectives. You're all in different parts of the journey. This was a question that says, one key to success in digital strategy and pull through will be finding great talent. Can you take a second and just talk about winning that war for talent in your respective organizations? How is that affecting recruiting? How is that affecting your talent and retention pool? And maybe even moving people out if that's necessary. So is it somebody that maybe have a tech background but no pharma, a pharma background but no tech, but you can train, so Abhay, well, can I start with you?
I think the good news is that you don't really need to start from scratch. Like my co-panelists have been saying, that the adoption of digital is already a part of our life. And if you see the amount of screen time that an individual spends, maybe through social interaction, social media, news, and all that, I think the familiarity with the whole ecosystem is there. It's now saying that can we use the same ecosystem to help you do your business? So I don't think you really need to start from scratch. So if today I'm looking at biologists and pharmacists and chemists to do the job for me in the pharmaceutical world, I don't think I need electronic engineers to replace the whole lot of them. But what I do need is people who are willing to learn, who are willing to adapt, and who are willing to grow. I think that's the kind of a mindset. To me, the war of talent is the war of winning mindsets, and look for individuals who have those traits, rather than look at digital savvy as my cornerstone of talent, either recruiting or training or something, but to leverage on what they already have and to build up nice layers on top of that where they can bring that into their work life.
Sharon, you're in the early stages. What's the thought there?
Yeah, absolutely. I honestly think that, great talent is attracted to great cultures. And I think that, that includes really smart use of virtual technologies as an enabler to succeed in realizing your vision. Culture isn't aspirations, it's actions. And I think that really thoughtful use of digital strategies across all aspects of the business really shows that you're future forward, and you're keeping up with real time changes, and you're going to be able to succeed in this new world.
Yeah, and Reg, this kind of I'll thank you for that. I'll kind of fold two questions in for this because it makes sense. But so talent wise, what are you doing? And then more specifically, someone's asking directly to Reg, what are the digital channels that you use to connect with patients? So I think those two things can be kind of merged together.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think the talent one's a good one. And again, it depends on your time point of where the company is in the strategy, as Sharon had explained and articulated. So I think 3 years ago, it wouldn't have made sense for KDX to heavily invest in what we imagine is digital, going beyond the mere connection into data analytics, et cetera, and a direct connection with the patient. A year ago, it made absolute sense for us to now formulate and deliver on that plan, which is now, we've executed on the last 12 months. We continue to grow. So I think it depends firstly on the time point. That's question number one. Question number two is, based on that, do you want someone or a group that's going to be in-house or outsourced or a hybrid? I think that's really important because I think digital expertise is so hard to get, particularly great digital expertise. And some people may think of it as a commodity, but I think if you think of the software developers, and probably where Sebastian and I are coming from, where these just can't be always naturally outsourced, and that becomes more of a strategic asset as you think about it. And I think where we also know is what's changed things in terms of COVID is that the ability to work remote as well. So does that mean, the war for talent in the Bay Area is very, very tough, right? I mean, you have some of the largest developers, the largest developers in the world, right, based there. So, having that strategic investment in Omaha, where we have 70 plus software developers, was a strategic asset for us as well, and done very good. So that talent will now lower the attrition rate, and we can strategically build around that as well. I think the other thing is, as Sharon articulated, is having leaders, and leadership is so important. So people will join great leaders. So as you reach that time point where you now have to develop that new vision, I think it's really important. So we've made these bets. We just hired 3 weeks ago, one of the senior executives from Sona, for example, now to run our digital business. And I've actually taken over that digital business as well as of 3 weeks ago formally. So it's an area that we want to continue to invest in. So I think people at the leadership level who believe in this really helps drive the attraction as you go and start recruiting, and then the ability to keep them is really important, particularly in the Bay Area where there's a lot of ping-ponging back and forth. On the digital channels, there are multiple ways that we interact with the patients. The primary one that we developed over the last 12 months with patient care managers. Now, patient care managers are ex-transplant coordinators. They've come from certain centers, and more than probably half our commercial presence is now these patient care managers, and they have a direct interface with the patients. And now what we're evolving from is using the app as a way of now further progressing that interaction, from scheduling and from basic questions that may come up, et cetera. How do we connect back to the centers, et cetera? So that's sort of the initial infrastructure we put in, was to have that direct patient interaction. Other ways of outreach is we partner with every single major patient association, and that's been so important for us because the name of KDX has been out there for more than 20 years. The third thing is we've built a set of patient advocates, and I think those patient advocates have helped us get the word about KDX, but more importantly, they're now helping us build this digital approach, right? How do we enable this connection interaction? between the patient and also KDX. And so now we have, an active, social media site as well as part of that. We have the patients that we've interacted with, the associations we interact to help build that. So I think, once again, the multiple forms of digital channels, some very direct, whether it's through the app, other ones which come from the patient themselves using a digital interaction. But I can only see this level of communication increasing, and there's other forms of channels which I won't go into now because I'm probably going over. But I just think it's such a fantastic opportunity to directly interact with the patient.
Sure. No, thanks for that. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. We've got a couple more minutes. If first of all, I want to thank everybody for, time is, I don't know, I keep saying this, at least at home, is time seems to be much more valuable these days. I don't think people respect it as much for some reason. So taking an hour out of your days is much, much appreciated, because I know it's probably more valuable than it was about a year ago. So thank you. On behalf of Indegene, I just want to thank everybody for that. If anybody has any closing thoughts, feel free. We've got another minute or two, but with that, we can close and move on. But again, wonderful discussion. This has been different. Certainly, last year we did this in a big ballroom in Philadelphia with 500 or 600 people, and this is different. And we're adapting, and we're all adapting. So really appreciate everybody's flexibility and everybody's time commitment and engagement today. It was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And thanks so much to Indegene. I think this was a great chat and very, very informative and educative for me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and we'll have some networking sessions, and hopefully, this was a strategically constructed panel as well, because we think that there's some overlap and some ways that maybe people might be able to start forming relationships and take advantage of the wonderful knowledge that each of you have. So on behalf again of us, thank you. And
thank you so much.
The audience, cueing the applause. I'm not sure I'm hearing it, but thanks. So
take care.
Take care.
Take care, everybody. Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.